Welcome to this presentation about CBD hemp production. We will be touching two subjects during our presentations today. First of all, we would like to learn how to propagate hemp clones. Mitchell Ankney is going to help us with that. And then secondly, we're going to focus on how to grow it out in the field, and specifically in high tunnels, because we think that that's quite a nice application for smaller growers in a high tunnel to produce quality hemp flower from. Here in the background, we have some hemp plants that we are growing in the greenhouse at the moment. Now, what is the reason for this whole project? Started thinking last year with the first big season of plants and material that went into the ground. There was a lot of bad propagated clones out there, and a lot of growers had a lot of damage in terms of plants that didn't establish well, and obviously didn't get the end result there. Plant material is so super expensive. You need to make sure that every plant counts in the field, and that you get all your material well established. So in order to do that, you need to have a quality clone with a quality root ball around it. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's also a lack of quality information out there in terms of which trays works best, what is the procedure from actually making the cut itself to what rooting hormone to use and what trays to use. So those are the kinds of things that made me wonder as to, okay, what can we do to help the industry? So we've gone through our first summer, half the summer now, with our plants in the field, and they are looking pretty good, and we've learned some experience or some things from the experience, and I think those are some of the things that we would like to share with you during these presentations.
All right, my name is Mitchell Ankney, and I am a graduate student, or just graduated from Purdue University with a horticulture degree, and I'm very passionate about cannabis production. I have been researching this plant for the past year and did a literature review over it. There's a lot of hearsay out there and a lot of stuff that doesn't quite work. And there's also a lot of just lack of quality information. But essentially, when it comes to propagating cannabis cuttings, the biggest quality we like to look for is a really thick stem diameter. We don't want anything too lanky and spindly like this. But we really are looking for something that's about pencil thickness or a little bit thinner than that. And we want about 5 inches of length in the cutting so we can stick it to the bottom of the tray. And we want to take our cutting at a 45-degree angle. And we want to take it below the node if possible. If not, that is a-okay. I'll go into more detail about this later when we can get more in depth on the plants. But for now, I'd like to just touch on that this is a plant that requires a lot of energy, a lot of light. It can take up a lot of food, and there's a lot of misinformation that you should not really feed your plants, when that is not true, when you need to really feed them because they really accumulate and scavenge for resources constantly. And these are two different varieties of plants. There's drastically different growth characteristics amongst both of them. As you can tell, this variety is a little more lanky, but has thicker stems compared to this variety that is way thinner stems, less purple, but a little more bushy. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how to take care and maintain mother plants for cannabis. This is a scavenging plant, and it likes to accumulate, so it likes a nice big root zone. So that's why we like to opt for fabric pots. Because if this plant gets root bound, it really does throw a fit, and it has a hard time accumulating and just acquiring nutrients. So what we like to do is we take plants that are in about 4-inch containers, and we let them root to about this amount of rooting, so it's nice and filled out, a nice white healthy root ball. And we will take these and we transplant these 4 inchers into about 3-gallon fabric pots right here. Once we transplant them into the 3-gallon fabric pots, we really only have to water them once a day. And then once we have to start increasing watering on them more than like 2 to 3 times a day, you might have to pot them up again to a 10-gallon pot. You can use the same rule of thumb for these. Once you have to start watering these more than once or twice a day, it's usually a good sign that they need to be potted up. There's also start getting really root bound and start throwing fits and have nutritional disorders. All right, so first thing we want to do is make sure that the vents are closed on our humidity domes. So right now they're in a completely open state. I'm just going to gently turn it right here, and now there is no opening at all for humidity and air to escape. The reason we want to do this is to reduce transpiration in our cuttings so they do not wilt, and we want doing that by keeping the humidity really high so it's not going to be losing any moisture to keep the cuttings turgid. And then we are going to be using a misting hand mister, and we're just going to take the dome and we're going to spray the inside of it to really raise that humidity and so that the moisture content stays within our cuttings and they don't wilt. So we're going to be trying to take cuttings from lateral branches that are about pencil thick. We want to avoid really spindly branches like I said earlier, like this. So what we want to do is take cuttings that are about 5 inches in length, and we're going to take and cut at a 45-degree angle right beneath the node. And then you want to remove all the bottom leaves and lateral branches just by pulling it off. And I like to leave just 2 to 3 leaves at the top, and I leave at least 2 to 3 growth points in case one aborts it has somewhere else to grow from. Next thing I like to do is I dip it into my rooting hormone, which this one's just dip and grow. It's an alcohol-based rooting hormone. It helps sear the IBA into the cutting. I just leave it in for a few seconds, and then I just stick it into the charged substrate, and then put the humidity dome back over it to keep the humidity high. So on the first day, you pretty much take your cuttings, and then you get them inside your dome. And then you also want to sub-irrigate your trays with a weak nutrient solution. We use around 125 to 175 parts per million of nitrogen, and that is primarily in the form of nitrates. And then you pretty much just want enough to fill up a quarter of the tray in the bottom. And then after that, you want to make sure that your domes are very secure on and that they're completely closed at the top so the humidity cannot escape. You should be able to see a nice condensation by the second day on your dome like this, and that's how you know that you have plenty of humidity in there. If you're in a larger scale facility, you can probably have like mist units to keep your humidity around 90% to 92%. But on day about 7, about the end of the first week, we can start opening our humidity domes all the way to start slowly hardening off the clones to get them used to using the root systems that they probably are establishing at this time. And then essentially by day 14, these should be able to be out of the dome or in about a 70% humidity environment inside of a glass house, hardening off, getting ready for the field. Nice. So that was our little introduction video. And now I'm going to go right into my presentation here. So essentially what I'm going to be covering is I'm going to go over water chemistry at first, and then I want to go over some mother plant management, fertility management. I want to talk a little bit about light spectrums and how that affects the plant growth. I want to talk about tray cell size, rooting hormones, and root development, and hardening off clones. So first, to start talking about water chemistry, it's very important that you test your starting water because you need to know how much carbonates are in there, how hard your water is, and what the pH is. Because if you have really high alkalinity, that's pretty much like a buffer that's going to keep your pH high, even if you keep adding like acid to it. It's going to keep just canceling out and keeping your pH high. So it's important to know your alkalinity. So it's very important to send your primary water, the water you're going to be using for your irrigation, and get it tested. A good application you can use to pretty much calculate how much acid you will need once you get your water tested is called AlkCalc. The link is right here. And essentially, you can use this simple chart that is on the screen here, and you can input your numbers into the AlkCalc calculator, and it'll tell you exactly how much acid you have to inject, and it'll tell you how many like ppms of the nutrient you're going to be getting. So you can use like sulfuric acid, nitric acid, phosphoric acid, citric acid, and it'll help you tell you how much you need to reduce your pH to the proper range. So it's a really nifty little tool, and I highly recommend it. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of everything for you. Ooh, what is going on here? Sorry about that. All right, and then I want to talk about essentially why your pH is so important. So when your target should be around 5.8 to 6.2 pH for soilless substrate culture, which is what you're essentially going to be growing in the greenhouse. So if you're too acidic, below like 5.0, you're going to have too much like micronutrients available and also too much aluminum available, and your plant will take it up into toxic levels and it'll pretty much make your plant very sick. And then if you're too high on the pH scale, you can't really take up your like magnesium or calcium because this is being locked out. So your goal is to try to maintain your pH between 5.5 and 6.5. And it's important to test your runoff water to make sure that that water chemistry inside the container is actually in the proper pH range. And then I talk a little bit about what your fertilizer balance should be. I have a chart right here on the left, and it shows you that you want pretty much for a constant feed, for full strength, you want around like 200 parts per million of nitrogen. I mean, you guys can read this, but this is essentially the ratio you're aiming for. And you want a 4 to 2 to 1 ratio of potassium to calcium to magnesium in parts per million. As else you will have pretty much a lockout in one of those nutrients because all three of those nutrients compete with each other. So this is why it's important to test your starting water so we know exactly how much nutrients we have to add to it or what fertilizer we would have to pick to add to it to have healthy plants. So I'm going to go into a little bit about mother plant management here. And essentially, you're going to want to have a gallon of substrate per week of growth that you're planning on having these mother plants, because they can easily colonize a whole gallon of substrate in a week's time. And when these plants get root bound, they have a lot of nutritional disorders. They prefer to take up nutrients at their root tips. So when it can't grow more root tips and it's girdled out in a pot, you're going to have a lot of issues. Another thing we like to do is have high light intensity. This encourages really stocky growth of a lot of nodes and really thick stems. And this is key to a really nice quality cutting. And so you have to make sure that you're providing at least like 30 to 40 moles of light per meter squared a day. And you can use a quantum meter to help measure your ppFD to figure out if you have enough light intensity or not. Another thing that's super important for mother plants is you really do need a well-draining substrate. Cannabis absolutely hates having wet feet. So if you want, you can use a coconut core with a bark and perlite mixture. Essentially, you want 60% moisture content when the container is completely saturated. So at container capacity, you want just 60% moisture pretty much. So a really well-draining substrate to keep the roots aerated so it doesn't get root rot. Some of the mother plants or some of the genetics, they grow extremely dominant like Christmas trees. They grow straight up like a Christmas tree. So you have to pretty much just, the term is topping it, but you just take some scissors or a knife and you cut the main growth point off, and it'll force the plant to grow really bushy. So you get more cuttings per plant because you have more consistent thick stems all around your plant. And then you can take about 8 to 10 to 12 cuttings per mother plant per week if you want, if you do that. So this is a little daily light integral in Indiana to kind of give you an idea how much you have to supplement during what part of the year. As you can tell, if you're growing indoors in like January, February, March, there's not much light, so you can probably have to supplement. And a lot of people still use HPS lights, but I'll get into that later. But it really boils down to make sure that your ppFD is high enough or your light intensity is high enough so you really have thick stems and dense nodes on the plant to have a quality cutting. And then, yeah, here's a day length in central Indiana. And as you can see, the photo period, it starts dropping after July. So we really want to get these plants into the field around the last week of May to June. So that means you're going to have to start taking cuttings at least probably in March, April time to have enough to get these plants in the field for the start of the season to have quality, healthy plants that are going to yield well in the field. So here's some nutrient deficiencies. Here's a nice chart you can look at to try to use some visual cues to diagnose any stick like deficiency, like any problems you have with your cannabis plant. So you can see that we have nitrogen right here on the left. This is what the initial symptoms look like. Oops. It's, the top is the initial, then we have the intermediate and the advanced, so you can see how it progresses. This is a very good thing to give you an idea of what's going on, but you still should always send your plant tissue samples into a lab to get it analyzed so you can figure out what exactly is going on so you can make an accurate adjustment. Because if you think it's something but it's really something else, you're kind of just throwing cash down the drain and it's not going to solve the problem. So here's a little bit of fertility management for mother plants and clones. And essentially, with your clones, your initial cuttings, you want to charge the substrate with about a 1.0 to 1.5 EC, or just 125 to 175 parts per million of nitrogen. The reason for this is because right when those plants root, they're going to be really hungry and searching because they use a lot of their own nutrients inside of themselves to develop that root ball. So you want to have fertilizer right there ready for it to have access to right when it roots so it can pretty much grow immediately. And then once you transplant that up, you want to give it about 1.5 to 2.0 EC constant feed, which comes out to be about 175 to 250 parts per million of nitrogen roughly. And then that's like into the 4-inch pots. And then once you get to your large 3-gallon containers where it has a larger root zone, that's when you want to start bumping your EC up more and start increasing the concentration of fertilizer. So then you can constantly be giving it 200 to 250 parts per million of N, sometimes even up to 300 parts per million of nitrogen is even fine. But one of the common issues that people run into with mother plants after they've been growing for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, is that they run into magnesium deficiency. And one of these main reasons is because that the substrate most people get is charged with like lime already in it. So once you water it frequently enough, it's going to leach out all that magnesium. So if you don't have enough magnesium in your water, you're going to need to supplement some magnesium sulfate, which all you need is about 2 pounds per 100 gallons, and that should fix your issue and charge your substrate again with magnesium. But yeah, that is probably the most common deficiency I see in cannabis is magnesium. And that is just simply because it got leached out, or it's just getting root bound and it can't take up anymore, or the pH is too high. So ideal plant material for cuttings, you really only should take clones from disease-free plants. There's no really certified sprays for like fungus and like just pathogens. So you want to start with nice, healthy, disease-free plants that will root and be vigorous growing plants because these are expensive cuttings. And each one of these that go in the field really need to produce enough for the farmer to get a return on his investment. Cuttings should contain at least 2 growth points, like I said in the video, because you don't want your growth point to abort or die off, and then your clone can't grow anywhere. So it's very important that you have 2 growth points at least. So if that does happen, it can still grow out of it and be just fine. I know here it says take plant material that is 3 inches. I would say at least 3 inches in size when you're taking your cuttings, because if it's too small, it's probably gonna be really thin and spindly as well. And it probably won't be a vigorous growing plant, and it probably won't transplant and perform well in the field at all. So when you're taking your cuttings, you really do need to avoid using scissors because scissors crush the stem of it when you actually like cut it off. So it's better to use like a razor blade or a grafting knife that you can make a clean cut through. And that will just expose you want to cut about 45 so you can expose the most pretty much surface area to the auxin and also the substrate so it can root. And one of the reasons why people like to take cuttings below or like right through the node is because there is the most like hormones there for growth, and it usually roots more vigorously there. And another thing you want to do, like I said in that video in the beginning, is you really need to remove all those lower leaves, and you only need like 2 to 3 leaves max on your cuttings at the top. And then some people prefer to trim the leaves, the fingertips off the fan leaves, and it's kind of a trade-off if you do that. So a benefit of trimming your leaves is that you're less likely to get pathogens like powdery mildew inside your domes or under your mist units inside of large scale. But the issue with that is that the clones don't root nearly as vigorous when you trim the leaves like that. So it's a little trade-off. You get a little more pathogen avoidance when you trim your fan leaves, but at the same time, you're not going to have as much vigorous rooting when you do that. So you got to find what works best in your situation. So this is a visual thing of what we found when we did rooting hormones versus no hormones. A lot of people say in the industry that you don't need rooting hormones at all for cannabis. I've heard that a lot. And we've tested it, and we've had our plants root much quicker and more vigorously with using rooting hormone. And it actually was able to uptake nutrients way quicker and grow way faster. Whereas you can see the plants that had no hormone on the right, they were stunted and behind, and they're really just starving and trying to build their roots. The product we used for our rooting is called Dip and Grow Rooting Solution. You only need to use a very weak concentration of it, just a 1 to 20 ratio. So 1 part of the Dip and Grow solution to like 19 parts water to dilute it. And yeah, we've had great success. We just put our clones into that for like about 3 to 5 seconds, and it usually sears the rooting hormone into the stem of the cannabis plant for us, and it softens it up so it has a really easy time rooting. So I want to talk a little bit about the ideal environment for freshly taken cuttings. So we talked about how we want to avoid wilting, and our goal with that is just to reduce transpiration or how much our little cuttings are losing water at a time. So we can do that through increasing the relative humidity, lowering the light intensity, and lowering the horizontal air movement. So if you're in a very large scale facility, you might want to opt to use misting, like little mist nozzles above your plants instead of domes. But you want to keep that humidity around 90 to 92% after you freshly take those cuttings to make sure they don't wilt at all. And then essentially from there, you want to reduce your humidity by about 5% each day after they're taken and put into the substrate. So they'll slowly harden off and get used to that, pretty much the growing environment they're going to be in. So about every single day, you should drop it by 5% for about 7 days. And then you should keep it around 70% humidity roughly. And then they should be in about their proper vegetative growth environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about light spectrum really quickly, because I don't want to eat up too much time here. So there is light intensity, that is how much plant food is being delivered at a time. And then there's light quality, like what is the plant food coming in? Is it blue light, red light, green light, yellow light? So there's all different effects from what type of light it gets and how it grows. And then the light intensity is just how much of it are we getting. So the required daily light integral, or how much do we need in a day of plant food for cannabis cuttings, is about 10 micromoles per meter squared per day, which is not too much at first, but then it ramps up constantly to about 15 to 20 in like weeks. So you can really photo acclimate this plant rapidly to get it ready to go to the outdoors. So when you use blue light, it will produce stockier clones, because blue light has been found to make the nodes grow way closer, so the internodal distance shortens. So you actually have stockier clones, and you also have thicker stems usually. So this helps you have a healthier clone for going out into the field. So here's just a graph of what each of the light spectrums activate in the plant. I'm not going to get too far into that, but the photo on the right is a light spectrum of an HPS light. And as you can see, there is no blue at all really, and there's a bunch of green, yellow, and orange. So moral of the story of this is you want to look for lights that have a full spectrum usually, because you want to activate all these plant pigments inside of the plant to really have maximum photosynthesis happening. So here's the lights we've used for our research in the glass house. As you can see in the far one, we have a full spectrum light, and there's the graph for it right here to the right. And then we have the red and blue plus light, or the Patriot plus light, and that's the spectrum here. But as you can tell, both of the lights have a good amount of blue in it, but the full spectrum just has a whole lot more green and yellow in it to help penetrate the light deeper into the canopy. So I'm talking a pinch about tray selection here. So you want to opt for trays that avoid girdling in plants. I can talk a little bit about that more in a second. So you want to look for trays that could potentially air prune. And air pruning helps desiccate the bound roots back so it grows more fibrous roots, like this photo here on the right. So you get a nice fibrous root ball, and it has a way better chance of surviving transplant in the field when it has fibrous roots like this, because it can easily start spreading and just acclimating to the new soil it got transplanted into immediately. And then another thing I want to touch on is planting density. So there's the 50 cell trays, the 72 cell trays. These trays right here is what I'm talking about. So when you have a 72 cell tray, that's what we usually go with, is what we found works really well, is it's going to be more dense. So you might have to look out for is powdery mildew and pathogens, because it's a much denser, just plant dense, yeah, just a lot more plants. And then the 50 plug trays, you get less plants in it, but you have more time to hold them over, because these things root quick, and you don't want them to be root bound, like I said constantly. Root bound is no bueno. So you want to use 50s if you're trying to buy a little bit more time, and also if you have like powdery mildew issues or pathogen issues, and then you might also want to trim your leaves if that's the case. But what we have found is that these 72 star plug trays, the deep ones, work fantastic for cannabis. I'm not trying to product place anything for anybody here, but these work great. We just stick our cuttings all the way down to the bottom of the tray, and the whole stem roots kind of like a tomato does. If you bury it deeper, it just roots more off the stem. Same thing of cannabis cuttings. So stick that cutting to the bottom of the tray, and it should fill out the whole plug in no time. And here's a little visual of what I'm talking about for girdling. The plant here on the left, you can see the roots are more guided downwards. And it's a nice, like, filled plug all the way completely. Very little brown roots, a lot of white, healthy roots. Like, none of these clones look bad at all, but that just has a superior root ball. And then if you look at the 50 round plugs, you can see that girdling right here where this arrow is. And that is what usually leads to like nutritional uptake problems, and usually leads to also like root rot because water can't drain out of the containers well. So that is the value of having trays that actually guide the roots down and prevent it from girdling. And then the reason why we want to have different tray sizes and maybe use a 4-inch container is because sometimes the weather is unpredictable and we have a lot of heavy soils in Indiana. So if it rains a lot, there's going to be wet fields and you really can't plant into it because you're going to get root rot and lose all the plants that get transplanted. And then you don't want your plants to get root bound in the trays because then you have nutritional issues, and then you got pretty much angry plants that are not going to transplant nearly as well into the field. So here's pretty much what we do. So step one takes about a week to 2 weeks after you take your cutting to fully root your plug or get it pretty well rooted. And then your next step is you want to put it into a 4-inch container like this. And in about a week to a week and a half, they'll fully fill out these 4-inch containers. And then finally, you're going to want to take your 4-inch container and you can transplant that when it's nice and fully rooted like that photo shows. You can put it right into anything you want. You can put it into a 3-gallon pot for indoor production. You can put it into the soil for outdoor production. So that is our process from start to finish, and that's what it looks like. So hardening off clones indoors, clones will initially be close to around 100% relative humidity, and we will slowly reduce that relative humidity by 5% each day, like I said earlier, until it's about 70% relative humidity. And it will be around 0.4 to 0.8 kilopascals for the vapor pressure deficit to make sure that it's not pulling too much moisture out of our cuttings and not stressing them out. But here's just the first step of a cutting rooting. That's thalli forming. Then the next step for it is to form these little roots right here. And then it will be a fully rooted plug like that. And that's the process. And hardening off clones outdoors. So a lot of clones are grown under artificial lights. So you really have to slowly like increase their light intensity to get them ready for the full sunlight. So it's important that you photo acclimate them by using some sort of shade cloth or any structure outside so it doesn't get the full-on sun right away. And then they rapidly acclimate to the environment they're in. So once you move them out to that like high tunnel, shade cloth, wherever, they'll rapidly get ready for those new conditions. So they won't have nearly as much transplant shock when you finally put them in the ground in the full sun. And then you'll notice if you got really like transplant shock, you see a lot of yellow leaves at the bottom, droopy leaves. It looks like maybe it's like wilting. That is a big sign of transplant shock. And it probably stunt the plant for about a week of time, maybe 2 weeks. And yeah, so you want to make sure that temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and you don't want to get really hot, like above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, because this is a C3 plant. And when the leaf temperature itself goes above 25 degrees Celsius, it will start to photorespire, which is a fancy term for I'm taking in oxygen when I should be taking in CO2, and I can't make photosynthesis as well at all. So it stresses the plant out and it gets stunted again. So try to keep the temperatures below 80 if possible during the day. You got to watch out for like frost damage as well, because sometimes it would be a cold snap, and these plants are not built for the cold really. So if you get a cold snap, that's something to also look out for. Overhead watering, essentially, you want to you can use misting nozzles to help keep them hydrated. If you just need to put them in a shade structure for a while and you have a ton of cuttings on the field, you can just put them under that. But just watch out for powdery mildew, like I said. So you got to really monitor it closely. And you want to make sure that you're not oversaturating the plugs too when you get them, because that will lead to root rot and that will kill your plants entirely. So these plants can bounce back from being underwatered better than being overwatered. If you overwater it, you probably will kill this plant. And then you really have to check, like I said earlier, the water quality of that water you're going to be using on the farm, because there's a lot of calcium in it. You're going to be not getting any potassium taken up or any magnesium taken up, because they compete with each other. So it's very important that you are on top of your water quality. But yeah, that is essentially the presentation. I hope I didn't go too long. Thank you guys so much.